G'day team and welcome back to Overheard in the Emergency Room. I'm your host, Dr. Kois. I built this show so that I can talk about all the things I wish patients knew to avoid them coming to the ED in the first place, and to cover all the things I don't have time to talk with them about when they're actually in the ED. I had a week off from recording the show with spring break and taking some time for myself and my family. But we now have 500 subscribers across all platforms, including Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has supported the show and listened to it so far. It really motivates me to continue this work, which I believe is incredibly important in a space that is overrun by grifters. Today, we're going to talk about prevention, lab tests, and one of our tier 1 interventions that everyone should have in place, a primary care provider. And in typical Overheard in the Emergency Room fashion, let's start with a case of a man with a lot of information. Now, this is the case of a male who walked into the bay in the emergency room holding a piece of paper, not a phone, but actual paper. It was printed at 8 pages, front and back, covered in numbers, abbreviations, and color-coded flags. Green for good, yellow for borderline, red for out of range. He was 43, lean and athletic, and did CrossFit 5 times a week. He'd come in for chest pain, which in an emergency department gets our full attention, regardless of how fit you look. His ECG, normal. Chest x-ray, clear. Troponin, negative. Basic bloods, unremarkable. I did what every ED doc does when the workup is clean. I started talking with him. I tried to figure out what was causing the pain. Could there be any other life threat going on? Turns out he'd been smashing 800 milligrams of ibuprofen 3 times daily for the better part of a week. He had a sore ankle from training. He treated it himself like he had a grudge against his own stomach lining. The chest pain was almost certainly gastritis. His stomach was protesting the NSAID abuse. Simple fix: stop the ibuprofen, switch to acetaminophen and ice, and take a proton pump inhibitor for a fortnight to let the stomach recover. That part was easy, but when anyone in their 40s comes in with chest pain, they are going to get a conversation from me about the risk factors for cardiovascular disease. That's when he showed me his papers. He had a comprehensive lab testing protocol, one of those 100+ test longevity subscriptions you can buy online without a doctor. He had a subscription, 3 tests a year, because optimizing your metabolic health apparently requires more blood draws than a hematology ward. I looked at his numbers. His HDL was excellent, in the 80s. Triglycerides are nice and low, but his LDL was 170 milligrams per deciliter. Not a little high, but meaningfully high. I was about to talk to him about that when he beat me to it. I know what you're going to say to me about the LDL, doc, he said. But look at my HDL to triglyceride ratio and the LDL fractionation. It's mostly large, fluffy particles. Those are the harmless kind. I paused, asked him if he had a PCP who was working with him. I was concerned about his interpretation of his cholesterol numbers and that he was using that as justification for not further addressing his cardiovascular disease risk. This aligns with much of the conversation I see on social media, and it's very hard to undo in a 5-minute conversation in the emergency department. Here was a man who was genuinely invested in his health, who had done research, spent money, tracked biomarkers, and who had, through a steady diet of social media content from people selling him a particular story, arrived at a conclusion that gave him permission to eat the way he wanted and not worry about the number that should have been worrying him. We talked. I wasn't going to change his mind that evening. People sometimes aren't ready to receive information when it conflicts with a belief system they've invested time and money into building. But that conversation has stayed with me. Because this episode is exactly about this. How can we make sense of blood tests? Who should be ordering them? Who should be interpreting them? And why more testing is not always the path to better health. Welcome to Overheard in the Emergency Room, where we discuss evidence-based ways to achieve fewer bad days and more good decades. I'm Dr. Kois, and today we're talking about testing for prevention. Let's get into it. Before we get into the science, let's ground this in the framework we've been building all season. If you've been following along, you know about the 2-tier blueprint. Tier 1 is the non-negotiable foundation: diet, exercise, sleep, stress management, and having a primary care provider. Tier 2 is the upgrade layer. Useful tools once the foundation is solid, but not a substitute for it. Here's what I want you to notice about that list. A primary care physician is a tier 1 habit, not a nice to have, not a luxury, but part of the foundation. And one of the most important things your primary care physician does that an AI algorithm and a subscription service cannot do is order, interpret, and act on blood tests in a way that makes clinical sense for you as an individual. They may not always get the answers immediately, and ongoing symptoms can be tough to manage and investigate. Still, they are the OG longevity experts and are largely responsible for our increased lifespan over the last 100 years. We've talked a lot this season about diet, exercise, and sleep, and how lifestyle changes genuinely move the needle on these numbers that matter. LDL, blood glucose, HbA1c, blood pressure, and inflammatory markers. A plant-rich diet, regular exercise, including aerobic and resistance training, adequate sleep, and a healthy weight will shift all of these in the right direction. We have rock-solid evidence for that. But here's the key. When you have blood tests done and implement those changes, you need someone to recheck the numbers, to confirm things are moving in the right direction, to recognize when lifestyle is doing the job and when you need an extra hand from pharmacotherapy, to help guide you in a way that is consistent with your values and what is important to you. Someone who can make sure you're not missing something that's sitting quietly in a result from 2 years ago that nobody followed up on. That person is your primary care physician. I've said it before and I'll say it again. They are the original longevity expert. PCPs were practicing preventive medicine before influencers even heard of it. So today we're going to talk about the systems they use, where prevention guidelines come from, which specific tests are recommended, and how to have a smarter conversation at your next appointment. And then we're going to name some things happening in the online health space that I genuinely think are causing harm. Let's start with a question most people have never thought to ask. Where do prevention recommendations actually come from? In the United States, one of the most important bodies answering that question is the US Preventive Services Task Force, or USPSTF. Think of them as an independent panel of experts in primary care and prevention. Not funded by pharmaceutical companies, not affiliated with any medical device manufacturer. Their entire job is to systematically review the evidence and make recommendations about preventive services for people who don't yet have symptoms of a particular condition. Their process has 5 steps. First, they review topic nominations and select which health questions to address. Second, they develop a draft research plan. Third, they open that plan to public comment and finalize it. Fourth, they commission an independent, systematic review of all the available evidence, grade it, and develop a draft recommendation. And fifth, they put that draft recommendation out for public comment again before finalizing it. That is not someone on Instagram reading 3 papers and developing a hot take. That is a multi-year, multi-expert, methodologically rigorous process with public accountability built in at multiple stages. The USPSTF then assigns letter grades to its recommendations from A through to I. Grade A and B recommendations are those with good or at least moderate certainty that the net benefit of a preventive service is substantial or moderate. That means your US insurer is required to cover it. C means considerate depending on individual circumstances. D means harms outweigh the benefits. And I means the evidence is insufficient to make a call either way. Their recommendations directly shape what primary care physicians do in the clinic. In fact, the USPSTF has estimated that implementing its preventive recommendations has contributed to improvements in life expectancy and chronic disease prevention in the US over the past several decades. Other bodies produce guidelines as well. The American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, and the American College of Cardiology. These are developed through similar systematic processes, and we've already talked about them on this season. They draw on randomized control trials, large cohort studies, and meta-analyses, with expert consensus when the evidence is lacking. They are not just opinions. They are the best synthesis of the best evidence available at any given point in time. I want to spend a moment on how the evidence itself gets graded, because this matters for understanding how much confidence you should have in a given recommendation. The highest level of evidence is a well-conducted randomized control trial, or an RCT. In an RCT, participants are randomly assigned to receive the intervention or not. It also controls for as many variables as possible that might otherwise muddy the results. Above a single RCT, we have a meta-analysis. That is basically a pooled statistical analysis of multiple RCTs, which give us the most reliable signal we have in medicine. When guidelines are based on multiple well-conducted RCTs, you can be genuinely confident in them. When they're based on observational data or expert consensus alone, that's useful but carries more uncertainty. The guidelines I'm going to walk you through today are in the main grounded in solid randomized clinical trial evidence. Let's look at a first clinical area, glucose and diabetes. The American Diabetes Association releases updated standards of care every year. Their 2026 guidelines on improving care and promoting health in populations emphasize that type 2 diabetes is substantially preventable and that the window to intervene is not when somebody already has diabetes, it's when they are in the pre-diabetes range, where lifestyle changes are enormously powerful. So what should be getting tested and when? The ADA recommends that all adults aged 35 to 70 who are overweight or obese be screened for prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. If the results are normal, repeat testing every 3 years is appropriate. If prediabetes is detected, annual monitoring is recommended because roughly 5 to 10% of people with prediabetes progress to type 2 diabetes each year. The test used can be a fasting glucose test, a 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test, or a hemoglobin A1C or HbA1c test for short. The HbA1c is the most commonly used in clinical practice. It reflects your average blood glucose over the past 2 to 3 months, meaning it isn't affected by what you had for breakfast that morning. If the HbA1c comes back normal, below 5.7%, great. Keep doing what you're doing and retest in 3 years. If it's in the prediabetes range between 5.7 and 6.4, the intervention is primarily lifestyle, diet quality, exercise, and weight management. That's your tier 1 toolkit, working as designed. What I want you to notice is the logic embedded in this framework. You're not testing someone because testing is good. You're testing because you have a specific clinical question. Is this person's glucose metabolism on a concerning trajectory? Because the answer to that question changes what you do next. The test is in service of a decision. That matters, and we'll come back to it. Now let's talk about lipids. In March 2026, I mean literally weeks before this episode was recorded, the American College of Cardiology and the AHA, along with 9 other leading medical societies, released a new guideline on management of dyslipidemia. This replaces the 2018 cholesterol guideline and is the most comprehensive update in close to a decade. So what are the headline changes? First, the guideline restores specific LDL cholesterol targets, something that was controversially removed in 2013. And lower is better, and they've given us numbers to aim for based on individual risk. For people without cardiovascular disease and without significant risk factors, the LDL goal is below 100 milligrams per deciliter. For those with risk factors, diabetes, or a 10-year cardiovascular risk, the target drops to below 70. For people who have already had a heart attack or stroke, the goal is below 55 milligrams per deciliter. Second, the guideline now recommends using the newer AHA prevent risk equations rather than pooled cohort equations. These equations are more accurate, and importantly, they can now estimate 30-year risk for adults up to the age 59, not just 10-year risk. This is a significant shift. It means that a 42-year-old with a borderline LDL and a family history of heart disease might look fine on a 10-year horizon, but look very different on a 30-year horizon. That changes the conversation about whether to start lifestyle changes or consider medication. Third, the guideline recommends that all adults be screened for lipoprotein A or Lp(a) at least once in their lifetime. Lp(a) is largely genetic and does not respond to lifestyle changes the way LDL does. It's an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease that standard lipid panels miss entirely. Once you have that number, you don't need to repeat it. It stays essentially constant throughout your life. Fourth, apolipoprotein B or ApoB. It gets a clearer role in this guideline. ApoB measures the total number of atherogenic lipoprotein particles. And in certain situations, particularly when LDL is at or near goal, but triglycerides are elevated or diabetes is present, it can help guide further treatment decisions. This is clinically sophisticated and appropriate. It is not a reason to replace the standard lipid panel with a boutique panel of 37 biomarkers. Fifth, and this is an important philosophical shift, the guideline now places greater emphasis on earlier intervention. For young adults with an LDL persistently at or above 160 milligrams per deciliter, or with a strong family history of premature cardiovascular disease, earlier consideration of lipid-lowering therapy is now recommended. The underlying evidence is clear. Exposure to high LDL over a lifetime is cumulative. Waiting until someone is 55 and starting to treat cholesterol level at that point that has been elevated since their 30s is waiting too long. What does a standard lipid panel include? Total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, triglycerides, and often non-LDL cholesterol. Your GP can order this. You don't need a subscription service to get it done. And it gives your doctor the information they need to calculate your 10-year cardiovascular risk and have an informed conversation about what, if anything, to do about it. For the USPSTF's take on statins specifically, in adults aged 40 to 75 who have one or more cardiovascular risk factors, that is dyslipidemia, diabetes, hypertension, or smoking, and an estimated 10-year cardiovascular risk of 10% or greater, the USPSTF recommends prescribing a statin. That's a grade B recommendation. For those in the 7.5 to 10% risk range, clinicians should selectively offer a statin in shared decision-making with the patient. And on diet and physical activity for adults with risk factors for cardiovascular disease, the USPSTF also recommends offering behavioral counseling interventions targeting a healthy diet and increasing physical activity. Not as a soft suggestion. That is a grade B recommendation with clinical evidence behind it. So we've built the evidence base. Now let's use it. I want to pre-bunk you before I give you the myths, because that's how this works. Pre-bunking is the process of warning you about the manipulation techniques before you encounter them, so that when you do see them, your critical thinking activates rather than your confirmation bias. The two techniques I want you to watch for in today's episode when encountering information in the health and wellness space are, first, cherry picking. That is, selecting one finding or one paper that supports a conclusion while ignoring the overwhelming weight of evidence pointing the other direction. And second, motivated reasoning. When folks arrive at a conclusion first, usually a conclusion that conveniently supports a product or a dietary philosophy, and then working backwards to find evidence that supports it. Hold those in mind as we tackle these myths. So, myth number one, large, fluffy LDL is safe. Only small, dense LDL is the problem. You heard a version of this from my patient at the start of this episode. He had been told and genuinely believed that because his LDL fractionation showed predominantly large, buoyant particles, his high LDL of 170 was nothing to worry about. But here is what the science actually says. It is true that small, dense LDL particles are particularly atherogenic. They're smaller, they penetrate arterial walls more easily, they oxidize more readily, and they have a longer residence time in the circulation. The science on this is real. It is not true that large, fluffy LDL particles are benign. The evidence is unambiguous. Large LDL particles still raise cardiovascular risk. In prospective studies, large buoyant LDL is independently associated with a greater risk of coronary heart disease events. The risk is somewhat lower than with small dense LDL, but it is not zero. It is not safe. The more clinically useful metric, and one that the 2026 guidelines now emphasize, is ApoB. Every LDL particle, whether large, fluffy, or small and dense, carries exactly one ApoB molecule. ApoB is what allows the LDL particle to enter the arterial wall. The total number of ApoB-containing particles in your bloodstream, regardless of their size, determines how much LDL is getting driven into the arterial wall. That's the mechanism of atherosclerosis. So when someone tells you your LDL doesn't matter because it's the good kind, ask yourself, who does it benefit for you to believe that? In many cases, the answer is someone who wants you to continue eating a diet high in saturated fat without feeling concerned about your cholesterol. That is a motivated conclusion dressed up in a half-truth. So what's the takeaway? All LDL carries cardiovascular risk. Large particles carry less risk than small dense particles, but an LDL of 170 is not fine, regardless of the particle size, full stop. Myth number two. Get this panel of labs and we'll tell you exactly which supplements you need. This is a business model of a growing number of direct-to-consumer lab companies. And I want to be careful here because not everything in this space is bad. Some people genuinely don't have access to a primary care physician, and having the ability to get basic testing done independently has real value. I have a primary care provider and recently had to go to a direct-to-consumer lab just to get an appointment. The US healthcare system is so bad right now that that's the only way I could get it done with my schedule. But here is what happens when the business model is subscription-based testing. You need to find enough out-of-range results to justify the subscription. And if you run enough tests, you will find some out-of-range results. Some of those will be clinically meaningful. Many will not be. And when a company runs both the labs and sells the supplements to address the abnormal findings, you have a conflict of interest that is wearing a white coat. The supplement industry in the United States is largely unregulated. Under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994, supplements do not need to be proven safe or effective before they are marketed. A paper published in the American Journal of Public Health described this regulatory framework as insufficient and noted that the FDA's post-market surveillance authority is inadequate to protect consumers from ineffective or even harmful products. When a company runs 100 labs and finds that your vitamin D is at the lower end of the reference range and then sells you a proprietary vitamin D supplement to correct your deficiency at 5 times the cost of a generic product from any pharmacy, that is not longevity optimization. That is a very elegant business model. What should you actually do if you're concerned about a specific marker? Talk to your doctor. Ask whether that marker needs to be checked given your clinical picture. If treatment is indicated, your doctor can prescribe it, recommend it, and follow it up in a way that a supplement company cannot. So what's the takeaway here? Testing in the absence of a clinical question, interpretation, and a pathway to act on the results is not medicine. It's a service. Sometimes a useful one, often an expensive one, and at risk of occasionally being a misleading one. Let's make this practical. Here's a plain language guide to the blood tests that actually matter in primary prevention, what they're measuring, and how your tier 1 habits connect to them. The complete blood count. This measures your red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. It flags anemia, infection, and immune issues. Typically, it's done annually or as part of a general health review. Diet, specifically adequate iron, B12, and folate, directly supports healthy red blood cell production. The comprehensive metabolic panel. This covers your kidney function, that is your creatinine and urea, your liver function, ALT, AST, blood sugar, and electrolytes. Exercise improves insulin sensitivity and can reduce fasting glucose. Alcohol and certain medications, as well as overconsumption of calories and saturated fat, can affect your liver function as well. HbA1c and fasting glucose. As we discussed, these assess your glucose metabolism. The single most powerful interventions to lower HbA1c in the pre-diabetic range are dietary, quality, and exercise. A meta-analysis of lifestyle intervention trials in prediabetes shows that intensive lifestyle programs reduce the risk of progression to type 2 diabetes by around 50%. The lipid panel. That is your core cardiovascular risk markers. A plant-rich diet lowers LDL. Exercise raises HDL and lowers triglycerides. Weight management improves all of the panel markers, which include total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, and triglycerides. This is the tier 1 toolkit at work. If lifestyle alone isn't sufficient to reach your LDL goal, and for some people with genetically elevated cholesterol, it won't be. Statin therapy is safe, highly effective, and the most evidence-supported intervention in all of preventive cardiology. ApoB and Lp(a). ApoB gives a more complete picture of atherogenic particle burden, particularly in people with elevated triglycerides or diabetes who may have higher risk than their LDL suggests. Lp(a) is a one-time test. It's genetically determined and doesn't change meaningfully with lifestyle. But knowing it helps your doctor stratify your risk, and in people with very high Lp(a), consider more aggressive LDL targets. TSH and thyroid function. Thyroid hormone affects almost every organ system. Hypothyroidism raises your LDL, causes fatigue, and affects cardiovascular function. It's easily treated. Screening is generally recommended for women over 50, but can be checked at any age if there are symptoms. vitamin D, B12, and iron studies. These are markers most commonly flagged by commercial lab companies as critically low in people who are actually normal. Vitamin D deficiency is genuinely common, particularly in people with limited sun exposure or dark pigmentation of their skin. And supplementation is reasonable if levels are low. B12 deficiency occurs in people following strict vegan diets and the elderly, and in some people with bariatric surgery. Iron deficiency is common in menstruating and pregnant women. These are real conditions. They just don't need to be identified by a subscription service to be treated effectively. And that's it. You can obviously get more granular, but the real test is if the ordering provider is trying to answer a specific question. If a patient is not having symptoms with no specific risk factors, why are we getting ANA, cortisol, and hormone panels? All of the above makes most sense in the context of a relationship with a primary care physician, one who knows your history, your family history, your medications, and your risk factors. They are the person who decides what specific tests you need based on your personal clinical picture. They are the person who can act on an abnormal result, refer you to a specialist, or prescribe you a medication. That's the complete loop. Test, interpret, act, follow up. It is what safe, effective, preventive medicine actually looks like. So let's go back to the man in Bay 4 from the start of this episode. He was doing so many things right. He was exercising, he was invested in his health, he was monitoring his blood tests. He wanted to live well. Those instincts are genuinely good instincts. But somewhere along the way, the information he was consuming had been curated by people with a financial interest in a particular conclusion. And that curation had led him to a place where an LDL of 170 felt like a non-issue, where a subscription to a commercial lab felt like a substitute for a GP, and where his confidence in his own interpretation of a fractionated lipid panel exceeded his willingness to engage with the doctor who was raising a concern. He went home that night with instructions about his stomach and a recommendation to follow up with his GP about his cholesterol. Whether he did, I don't know, but the conversation mattered. Here is the message I want you to take from this episode. Your primary care physician is your original longevity partner. The USPSTF, the ADA, the AHA, they have spent years of methodological effort so that your doctor knows exactly which tests to run, when to run them, and what to do with the results. And yes, that system is imperfect, but it is evidence-based, publicly accountable, and not trying to sell you a supplement. So use it. Call your GP this week, book an appointment. If you're due for a preventive check, get it. Ask about your HbA1c if you've never had it checked. Ask about your lipids, ask about your Lp(a) if you've never had it tested before. Ask your doctor to explain anything that came back abnormal in a past test that never got followed up. And if a company on social media is telling you that you need to purchase 8 panels of labs to understand your body, and then coincidentally also sells the supplements to fix whatever those labs reveal, you now have the framework to recognize that for what it is. Fewer bad days, more good decades. That's what we're working towards. Your doctor is your partner in that goal. Let them in. And that's a wrap on episode 11. If this episode helped you feel more confident about navigating the world of blood tests and prevention recommendations, I'd love for you to subscribe wherever you listen. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you found us. Leave a review if you can. It genuinely helps other people find the show. And head to drkois.com if you want companion resources for this episode or any of the others in season 1. Next time on Overheard in the Emergency Room, we're stepping back from the individual and looking at a threat that's reshaping the health of entire populations: climate change and human health. It's an area I've done some work in, and I think it's one of the most important conversations in medicine right now. Don't miss it. Until then, peace and love, my friends. Get out into nature and do something physical you've never done before. And let's chase less bad days and more good decades together. See you next time.